Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Alexander Todd had built his life on three pillars: loyalty, integrity, and family. At 42, he owned a successful custom motorcycle garage in Austin, Texas, employing 12 people who respected him not just as a boss, but as a man who kept his word. His calloused hands told stories of 15 years building engines and dreams, while his steady gray eyes reflected a mind that calculated every move with precision. His marriage to Camille Todd had lasted 16 years, a union that began when she was a struggling art student and he was a mechanic with ambitions. She was 25 then, him 27, both believing they were building something eternal. Alexander had supported her through art school, celebrated her first gallery showing, and stood by her when her artistic career never quite took flight. In return, she had given him stability, a beautiful home, and their daughter Emma, now 14 and the light of his world. But marriages, like engines, sometimes develop cracks that aren't immediately visible. Camille, now 41, had grown restless in ways that Alexander noticed but couldn't quite pinpoint. Her auburn hair was always perfectly styled, her figure maintained through expensive yoga classes and personal training sessions. She traded her bohemian artist aesthetic for designer clothes and a social circle that revolved around charity galas and wine tastings. The woman who once painted barefoot in their garage now complained about the oil stains on his work shirts. "You smell like grease again," she'd say, wrinkling her nose when he came home. "Can't you at least shower at the shop?" Alexander would comply, as he always did, because keeping peace was easier than fighting. He told himself it was normal. People change, marriages evolve. He focused on what mattered, providing for his family and being the kind of father he'd never had. The warning signs had been there for months. Late nights at book club, weekend trips to visit her sister Marion in Dallas that seemed to happen with increasing frequency. New lingerie that never made an appearance in their bedroom. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. Alexander wasn't naive, but he was trusting. More accurately, he was a man who believed in the bonds he'd forged with his own hands and heart. When you've built something from nothing, you don't expect it to crumble without cause. The first real crack appeared on a Thursday evening in March. Alexander was working late, installing a custom exhaust system on a Harley-Davidson, when his phone buzzed with a text from Camille, staying late at charity meeting. "Don't wait up." 30 minutes later, Emma called from her friend's house where she was studying. "Dad, wasn't Mom supposed to pick me up? I've been waiting for an hour." Alexander frowned, checking his phone. No missed calls, no updated messages. He drove to pick up Emma himself, making excuses about miscommunication. But as he tucked his daughter into bed that night, a cold certainty settled in his chest. Camille didn't come home until 2 a.m., claiming the meeting had run long, and then she'd gone for drinks with the other committee members. "Which committee members?" he'd asked quietly. "Oh, you don't know them," she'd replied, already turning away. "Helen White and Marina Moss." We lost track of time. Alexander had met both women. Helen was a teetotaler who never stayed out past 9, and Marina had moved to Phoenix 6 months ago. That night, lying beside his wife in the darkness, Alexander Todd made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would no longer trust blindly. He would watch, listen, and learn. And if his worst fears proved true, he would respond in kind. Because Alexander Todd was many things: loyal, hardworking, devoted, but he was not a fool. And he was most certainly not a man who forgave betrayal. Chapter 2. The Girls' Trip. The revelation came with spring's arrival, wrapped in the innocent phrase, "girls' trip." Jenna's organizing a spa weekend in Sedona. Camille announced over breakfast, her tone carefully casual as she buttered her toast. "Just as girls, you know. Marina, Ellen, Caroline, we all need some time to decompress." Alexander nodded, sipping his coffee while his mind cataloged the lies. Marina lived in Phoenix now. Convenient. Helen was currently in Europe visiting her daughter. Caroline Klein had been posting on social media all week about her family vacation in Colorado. When, he asked simply. Next weekend, Friday through Sunday. Camille avoided his eyes, focusing intently on her breakfast. Jenna already booked the spa, non-refundable deposits, and all that. Emma looked up from her cereal. Can I come? I love Sedona. No, sweetheart, Camille said quickly. It's adults only. Very boring spa stuff. Alexander watched his wife's reflection in the kitchen window as she stood at the sink. Her hands trembled slightly as she rinsed her plate, a tell he'd noticed only recently. Camille had many talents, but lying convincingly wasn't one of them. At least, not to someone who'd been watching. You'll need someone to watch him, he said. Actually, Camille turned, her smile bright and artificial. I was hoping she could stay with your mother. You know how they love their weekend movie marathons. Another strategic move. His mother lived 2 hours away, meaning he'd be alone for the weekend. Perfect for whatever game Camille was really playing. I'll call Mom, Alexander agreed, his voice neutral. That afternoon, while Camille was at her yoga class, Alexander made some calls of his own. His friend Derek Hull worked in private security, a former military man who owed Alexander a favor from years back when Alexander had restored Derek's father's vintage Indian motorcycle for free. I need a clean phone trace, Alexander told him. My wife's cell. Can you do it without leaving digital fingerprints? Derek's voice was careful. That's a gray area, Alex. What's going on? She's cheating. I need proof before I make my move. A pause. Derek had been through his own messy divorce. How sure are you? Sure enough to ask you for an illegal favor. Give me the number. I'll have something by tomorrow. Alexander also called his lawyer, John Schaefer, a bulldog of a man who'd helped him incorporate his business. Hypothetically, Alexander said, if I were to discover my wife was having an affair, what would I need for a divorce? Evidence. Photos, communications, financial records showing unexplained expenses. Texas is a community property state, but infidelity can affect alimony and asset division. John's voice turned serious. Alex, if this is more than hypothetical, be careful. Don't do anything that could be construed as stalking or harassment. I'm always careful, John. That evening, Camille was unusually affectionate, as if her guilt needed absolution through performance. She cooked his favorite dinner, asked about his day, even suggested they watch a movie together. Alexander played along, noting how she kept checking her phone, how her laugh seemed forced. I'm really looking forward to this weekend, she said as they prepared for bed. It's been so long since I've had time with the girls. You deserve it, Alexander replied, meaning something entirely different. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth. Camille had packed more clothes than any spa weekend required, including the black cocktail dress she'd bought but never worn for him. Alexander helped carry her bags to the car, kissed her goodbye, and watched her drive away with the same expression he wore when diagnosing a failing engine. Focused, analytical, already planning the repair. Derek's call came an hour later. You were right to be suspicious, Derek said without preamble. Her phone's been pinging towers around the Driscoll Hotel downtown for the past 3 weeks, usually between 2 and 6 p.m. on weekdays. Never on weekends when you're home. The Driscoll, Austin's most expensive hotel, a place Alexander had never been despite living in the city his entire adult life. And the Sedona trip? Her phone's here in Austin. She never left. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. The last ember of hope extinguished, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Derek, I need another favor. A bigger one. Name it. I need to know who she's meeting at the Driscoll. And I need it documented. By evening, Alexander had his answer. Derek's surveillance photos were crystal clear. Camille entering the hotel at 3 p.m., her arm linked with a man Alexander recognized but had never actually met. Malcolm Porter, a real estate developer from Houston who'd been sniffing around Austin's luxury market. Tall, artificially tanned, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The photos told a story of practiced intimacy, hands on lower backs, whispered conversations, the easy comfort of lovers rather than new acquaintances. This wasn't a recent fling. This was an established affair, complete with routine and rhythm. Alexander studied the images on his laptop screen, his jaw tight. Malcolm Porter. He filed the name away with the same methodical precision he used to organize his tool collection. Saturday brought more photos. Camille and Malcolm at dinner, at the hotel bar, entering the elevator together with the casual confidence of people who own the world. Sunday evening, Alexander picked up Emma from his mother's house, listening to her chatter about their weekend activities while his mind worked through calculations. When they arrived home, Camille's car was already in the driveway. She met them at the door, glowing with what she claimed was post-spa relaxation. "Oh, you guys, it was exactly what I needed. So rejuvenating." "How was Sedona?" Alexander asked, pulling Emma into a hug. "Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. All red rocks and desert sunsets." Camille's voice was steady now, her lies polished smooth. "I took some pictures, but the lighting was terrible. You know how it is." Alexander nodded, knowing exactly how it was. That night, as Camille slept beside him, he lay awake planning. Not just the divorce, that was simple paperwork. No, Alexander Todd was planning something much more comprehensive. Something that would ensure Malcolm Porter and his cheating wife understood exactly what they'd chosen when they decided to betray him. Because Alexander had learned something important about himself over the past few weeks. He wasn't just a man who didn't forgive betrayal. He was a man who made betrayal expensive. Chapter 3. The Discovery. Monday morning brought clarity wrapped in routine. Camille kissed Alexander goodbye with the same plastic smile she perfected, told Emma to have a good day at school, and drove off to whatever lie she constructed for the day. Alexander waited 30 minutes, then called into his shop and told his foreman, Buddy Cooper, that he'd be in late. "Everything okay, boss?" Buddy asked. The older man had worked for Alexander since the shop's early days, and his loyalty was absolute. "Just handling some personal business. Hold down the fort." Alexander drove to the Driscoll Hotel, parking across the street in a spot Derek had recommended for surveillance. He didn't have to wait long. At 11:47 a.m., Camille's silver BMW pulled into the valet station. She emerged wearing the same outfit she'd claimed was for running errands, but her makeup was too perfect, her jewelry too expensive for grocery shopping. Malcolm Porter was waiting in the lobby, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The embrace they shared was intimate, comfortable, the greeting of lovers, not conspirators meeting for the first time. Alexander watched them disappear into the elevator, then checked his watch. He gave him an hour. Instead of stewing in rage, Alexander used the time productively. He called his accountant, Terrence Post, and scheduled an emergency meeting. He called his bank and requested detailed statements for all joint accounts going back 6 months. Most importantly, he called Derek. "I need everything you can find on Malcolm Porter. Business dealings, personal life, enemies, weaknesses, everything. That'll take some time and cost some money. I have both." Derek's preliminary report arrived by evening. Malcolm Porter, 45, divorced twice, no children. His real estate empire was built on leveraged investments and what Derek politely termed aggressive business practices. He'd made enemies in Houston's development scene through hostile takeovers and contract manipulations that skirted legal boundaries without technically crossing them. More interesting was Malcolm's personal pattern. He was a serial adulterer who specifically targeted married women in smaller cities, using his wealth and charm to seduce them before moving on to the next conquest. Camille wasn't his first Austin affair. She was simply the current one. Alexander read the report twice, memorizing details. Malcolm Porter wasn't just stealing his wife. He was following a playbook, treating Camille like a temporary amusement. The disrespect burned deeper than the betrayal itself. Tuesday brought the financial evidence Alexander had suspected he'd find. Charges at expensive restaurants he'd never been to, purchases at lingerie stores that never benefited him, even payments to a private phone service he hadn't known existed. Camille had been funding her affair with their joint account, probably assuming Alexander never checked the statements carefully. She was wrong about that, as she'd been wrong about many things. Wednesday, Alexander made his most important call. "Wayne Gates," the voice answered. Alexander's cousin by marriage. Wayne was everything Malcolm Porter pretended to be. Wealthy, connected, but with a moral code that made him dangerous to people like Porter. "Wayne, it's Alex. I need a favor. A big one." "Name it." Alexander had always appreciated Wayne's directness. "My wife's having an affair with a piece of shit named Malcolm Porter. Real estate developer from Houston. I want to destroy him, but I need someone with your resources and connections." Silence on the line. "Then send me everything you have on this guy. I'll make some calls." By Thursday, Wayne had assembled a picture of Malcolm Porter that was far more detailed than Derek's initial report. Porter's business success was built on a foundation of intimidation, bribery, and contractual manipulation that had left a trail of angry investors and ruined competitors. He'd survived legal challenges through expensive lawyers and political connections, but he'd never faced someone with Wayne's particular combination of wealth, influence, and motivated malice. "He's got 3 major developments in progress," Wayne reported during their Thursday night meeting at Alexander's shop. "All heavily leveraged, all dependent on city council approvals that could be complicated. What do you need from me?" "Nothing yet. I'm still gathering pieces." "But Alex," Wayne's expression grew serious. "What you're asking for, it's going to be permanent. Porter won't recover from this." "Are you sure?" Alexander thought about Camille's lies, about Malcolm's smug face in the surveillance photos, about Emma asking why Daddy seemed sad lately. "I'm sure." Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Camille's fake spa trip, she announced another weekend away. "Jenna wants to do it again," she said, her tone bright with false excitement. "We had such a good time. Same place, same group." Alexander nodded, sipping his coffee. "Sounds wonderful. You should go." This time, when Camille kissed him goodbye, Alexander didn't feel pain or anger. He felt anticipation, because while she spent the weekend in her lover's bed, Alexander would be executing the first phase of a plan that would teach both of them the true cost of betrayal. As he watched her drive away, Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from Wayne. "Pieces in place. Let's end this." Alexander smiled for the first time in weeks. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Chapter 4. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. Saturday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of a well-oiled machine. While Camille believed she was beginning another clandestine weekend with Malcolm Porter, Alexander Todd was implementing a plan that had taken 2 weeks to perfect. Derek Hull arrived at the shop at 8 a.m. sharp, carrying a duffel bag full of surveillance equipment. "You sure about this, Alex? Once we start, there's no going back." "I crossed that line the day she chose to lie to my face," Alexander replied, his voice steady. "Today we just document the truth." Wayne Gates had worked his magic with surgical precision. Through his network of political and business contacts, he discovered that Malcolm Porter's 3 major developments were all pending city council approvals that could be delayed indefinitely if the right pressure was applied. More importantly, Porter's financing was structured in a way that made him personally liable for massive penalties if construction didn't begin on schedule. "He's about to lose everything," Wayne had explained. "But I need something that makes it look like natural business consequences, not targeted harassment." That something was about to be provided. Derek had positioned cameras throughout the Driscoll Hotel's public areas. Lobby, restaurant, bar. Nothing illegal, just comprehensive documentation of what was already happening in public spaces. Alexander wanted a complete record of the affair, not just for divorce proceedings, but for the psychological warfare that would follow. At 2:47 p.m., the surveillance feeds showed Camille and Malcolm entering the hotel restaurant for what appeared to be a celebration lunch. They were animated, touching frequently, clearly comfortable in their deception. Alexander watched the feeds from his laptop in the shop's office, taking screenshots of the most damaging moments. But the real work was happening elsewhere. Jim McDermott, one of Wayne's business associates and a member of Austin's City Planning Committee, was having lunch with 3 other council members. The conversation, according to Wayne's later report, centered around concerns that had been raised about Malcolm Porter's business practices. Anonymous tips about safety violations, environmental impact studies that might need additional review, questions about minority contractor requirements that hadn't been properly addressed. None of it was fabricated. Derek's investigation had uncovered real issues with Porter's projects, Corner's Cut, regulations bent, procedures that met the letter of the law while violating its spirit. Alexander and Wayne were simply ensuring these issues received the attention they deserved. By evening, the first dominoes were falling. Malcolm received a call from his primary construction lender expressing concerns about project delays. The call was prompted by whispers that had reached the bank through channels Wayne had carefully cultivated. Nothing direct, nothing traceable, just enough uncertainty to make nervous bankers more nervous. Sunday brought the weekend's climax. Camille and Malcolm had planned a day trip to the Lake Travis area, an expensive retreat that Derek's cameras documented in detail. They looked like a couple celebrating an anniversary, not conspirators planning the destruction of a family. Alexander spent Sunday with Emma, taking her to breakfast and a movie, being the kind of father who was present and engaged. His daughter had noticed the tension in the house lately, and he wanted her to have good memories before everything changed. "Dad, are you and Mom okay?" Emma asked as they shared popcorn during the movie previews. Alexander looked at his daughter, his real treasure in a world full of fool's gold, and chose honesty over comfort. "We're going through some challenges, sweetheart. But whatever happens, you're the most important thing in my life. That will never change." Emma nodded solemnly, wise beyond her 14 years. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, Em. Always." That evening, as Alexander tucked his daughter into bed, his phone buzzed with updates from Wayne. The city council would be reviewing Malcolm's projects at an emergency session on Tuesday. Environmental groups had raised concerns about one development. Labor unions had questions about another. The third was facing zoning challenges that hadn't existed a week earlier. All perfectly legal. All completely devastating to a man whose business model depended on speed and momentum. Monday morning arrived with unexpected drama. Malcolm Porter called in sick to his Houston office, a rarity for a man who prided himself on never showing weakness. According to Derek's sources, Porter had spent Sunday night making frantic calls to lawyers and political contacts, trying to understand why his previously smooth projects had suddenly hit multiple roadblocks. Camille returned from her fake spa weekend glowing with satisfaction, full of stories about mud baths and meditation sessions that had supposedly taken place in Sedona. Alexander listened with the patience of a man who knew exactly where she'd spent her time and who she'd spent it with. "You seem stressed," she observed over dinner, perhaps noticing the steel in his eyes. "Everything okay at the shop?" "Just business," Alexander replied. "You know how it is?" But Camille didn't know how it was. She didn't know that her husband had spent weeks becoming someone she'd never met, a man who planned with the precision of a master craftsman and struck with the efficiency of a predator. She didn't know that her affair had awakened something in Alexander that had been sleeping for 42 years. She was about to find out. Tuesday's city council meeting was a masterpiece of bureaucratic warfare. Malcolm Porter, who had flown in from Houston that morning, watched his carefully constructed empire begin to crumble in real time. Project approvals were delayed pending further review. Environmental impact studies were ordered. Safety inspections were scheduled. Each delay triggered penalty clauses in his financing agreements. Each penalty pushed him closer to the financial cliff that Wayne had identified weeks earlier. Alexander watched the live stream from his office, feeling the satisfaction of an artist seeing his masterpiece take shape. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. Malcolm Porter was facing the consequences of his own shoddy business practices, amplified by the careful application of pressure at exactly the right points. By Wednesday, Malcolm was hemorrhaging money. His lenders were demanding additional collateral. His investors were asking uncomfortable questions. His lawyers were explaining that fighting City Hall would cost more than he could afford to lose. And through it all, Camille remained blissfully unaware that her secret lover was being systematically destroyed by her husband's carefully orchestrated campaign. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on Alexander. While Malcolm had been hunting his wife, Alexander had been hunting Malcolm. The only difference was skill. Soon, very soon, both predators would become prey. Chapter 5. The Network of Consequences. Thursday morning brought the kind of call that changes everything. Malcolm Porter's voice was strained when he answered Derek's carefully disguised inquiry about his availability for a business lunch. I'm dealing with some unexpected complications, Malcolm said, unaware he was speaking to an employee of the man whose wife he'd been seducing. My schedule's completely turned upside down. Derek relayed the conversation to Alexander with professional satisfaction. He's rattled. Whatever Wayne's doing is working. Wayne's strategy had been elegant in its simplicity. Instead of attacking Malcolm directly, he'd created a web of interconnected problems that appeared unrelated but were slowly strangling Porter's business empire. Environmental groups suddenly concerned about wetland preservation. Labor unions questioning minority contractor compliance. City planners discovering paperwork discrepancies that required extensive review. None of it was fabricated. Malcolm Porter's success had come from cutting corners and exploiting loopholes, practices that could survive casual scrutiny, but not the focused attention Wayne had orchestrated. Phase 2 starts today, Wayne told Alexander during their Thursday evening meeting. I've got a friend in the Houston Chronicle who's interested in a story about questionable development practices. Nothing libelous, just factual reporting about public records and city council concerns. Alexander nodded, understanding the implications. A newspaper investigation would create permanent documentation of Malcolm's problems, making it impossible for him to simply wait out the current crisis. Meanwhile, Camille had grown increasingly agitated as her lover's problems mounted. She'd started making more phone calls, always stepping outside or into another room when Alexander was nearby. Her book club meetings had become more frequent, and her story about weekend spa trips was wearing thin even by her own standards. I might need to go help Jenna this weekend, she announced Friday morning, not quite meeting Alexander's eyes. She's going through a rough patch. Divorce stuff. Alexander knew Jenna Brandt personally. She'd been happily married to the same man for 23 years and had never expressed interest in spa weekends or girls' trips. But he simply nodded and said, "Whatever you need to do." The surveillance of that weekend painted a picture of desperation. Malcolm and Camille met at the Driscoll as usual, but their body language had changed. Where before they'd been relaxed and confident, now they huddled together in urgent conversation. Derek's long-range audio equipment caught fragments of Malcolm's crisis, mentions of lawyers, delays, financial pressure. Camille was learning that her wealthy lover might not be as secure as he'd pretended. The knowledge clearly disturbed her. Sunday brought the weekend's most revealing moment. According to Derek's surveillance, Camille and Malcolm had a heated argument in the hotel parking garage. She wanted to know why he seemed distant, why their planned trip to Miami had been canceled, why he kept taking urgent phone calls during their time together. Malcolm's response, captured clearly on audio, was brutally honest. I'm dealing with some business complications. Nothing that affects us long-term, but I need to focus on damage control for a while. What kind of complications? Camille pressed. The kind that could cost me everything if I don't handle them right. Alexander listened to the recording with grim satisfaction. Malcolm Porter was beginning to understand that his world was unraveling, but he still didn't know why. The fear in his voice was gratifying, but it was only the beginning. Monday's Houston Chronicle featured a front-page article titled "Development Delays Raise Questions About Business Practices." The reporter, guided by Wayne's carefully provided information, had done excellent work documenting the pattern of problems plaguing Malcolm's projects. Environmental concerns, labor disputes, safety questions, zoning challenges. Individually, they might seem like normal business obstacles, but collectively they painted a picture of a developer whose corner cutting was finally catching up to him. The article was devastating precisely because it was factual. Every claim was sourced, every allegation documented. Malcolm Porter was being destroyed by the truth about his own business practices. Tuesday brought the financial avalanche Wayne had predicted. Malcolm's primary lender, spooked by the negative publicity and mounting delays, called in their loans. The construction company working on his largest project suspended operations pending payment of overdue invoices. His political contacts in Houston began distancing themselves from the suddenly radioactive developer. Camille returned from her fake weekend in a state of barely controlled panic. She'd seen her wealthy lover transform into a desperate man fighting for financial survival, and the change had shaken her carefully constructed fantasy. You seem upset, Alexander observed as she paced around their kitchen Monday evening. Just worried about Jenna, Camille replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Her divorce is getting messy. Financial complications. Alexander almost smiled at the accidental honesty. There were indeed financial complications in someone's relationship, just not Jenna's. Wednesday afternoon brought the call Alexander had been waiting for. Derek's voice was tight, with barely contained excitement. Porter's done. His main investor just pulled out, citing the Chronicle article and project delays. He's out maybe 2 weeks before everything collapses. And my wife, she knows. They had another meeting today, and she looked like someone had told her Santa Claus wasn't real. Reality's setting in. That evening, Camille was unusually quiet during dinner. She picked at her food, checked her phone obsessively, and seemed lost in thought. Emma, sensitive to adult emotions the way teenagers often are, excused herself early to do homework. Everything okay? Alexander asked his wife, injecting just enough concern into his voice to seem caring rather than predatory. Fine, Camille said quickly. Just tired. It's been a long week. A long week indeed. But it was about to get much longer. Because while Malcolm Porter was learning that his empire was built on sand, and while Camille was discovering that her wealthy lover was neither as wealthy nor as secure as she believed, Alexander Todd was preparing for the final phase of his campaign. The phase where his cheating wife and her failing lover would learn that some men don't just get mad. They get even. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs Shut. Friday arrived with the weight of inevitability. Malcolm Porter's financial empire wasn't just crumbling. It was in full collapse. Wayne's network had delivered the killing blow Thursday evening when the Austin City Council voted to suspend all permits for Porter's developments pending a comprehensive review of safety and environmental compliance. The suspension was the final domino. By Friday morning, Malcolm's remaining investors had fled. His construction crews had walked off jobs, citing unpaid invoices, and his lawyers were advising him to consider bankruptcy protection. Alexander received these updates with the calm satisfaction of a craftsman watching his work come together perfectly. Every piece had fallen exactly where he'd planned. Every pressure point had been applied with surgical precision. Now came the delicate part, ensuring Camille understood her situation without revealing his hand too early. I was thinking, Alexander said over breakfast, watching his wife push scrambled eggs around her plate without eating. Maybe we should take a real vacation soon. Just the 3 of us. Hawaii, maybe, or that place in Colorado Emma's always talking about. Camille looked up sharply, guilt and fear warring in her expression. Oh, that sounds nice. But maybe not right now. I'm in the middle of several charity commitments, and nothing that can't wait, Alexander interrupted gently. Family should come first. The comment hit its target. Camille's face flushed as she turned away quickly. I have some errands to run today. I'll be back this evening. Alexander nodded, knowing exactly where those errands would take her. Derek's surveillance confirmed what Alexander had expected. Camille drove straight to the Driscoll, but this time Malcolm wasn't waiting in the lobby with his usual confident smile. Instead, she found him in the hotel bar at 11 a.m., nursing what looked like his second or third scotch. The conversation, captured by Derek's equipment, was painful to watch. Malcolm was a broken man, explaining through alcohol-fueled rambling how his business was destroyed, his reputation ruined, his financial future obliterated. He kept repeating that it made no sense. Everything had been fine 2 weeks ago, and then suddenly every project had hit impossible obstacles simultaneously. It's like someone orchestrated the whole thing, Malcolm said, his voice slurred with drink and desperation. Like I was targeted specifically. Camille's response revealed everything about her character. Instead of offering comfort or support, she began distancing herself immediately. Maybe we should take a break, she said carefully, until things settle down. It's probably not good for us to be seen together if you're having legal troubles. Malcolm's laugh was bitter. Abandoning ship already? What happened to all that talk about leaving your husband? That was different, I thought. We need to be practical. Practical. Malcolm drained his glass. Right. Well, here's some practicality for you. I'm broke. Not broke like normal people complain about, but actually broke. Bankrupt. Finished. Still want to run away together. Camille's silence was answer enough. Alexander watched the surveillance feeds from his office, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Vindication, certainly. Justice, absolutely. But also something deeper. The satisfaction of seeing his wife's true character revealed in high definition. She'd been willing to destroy their marriage for wealth and excitement. Now, faced with a lover who could offer neither, she was ready to crawl back to the stability she'd been so eager to abandon. But Alexander Todd wasn't the same man she'd married 16 years ago. That man had trusted unconditionally and forgiven easily. This man had learned to calculate consequences and deliver them with precision. Saturday brought Camille's first attempt at reconciliation. She canceled her planned weekend trip, claiming sudden illness, and instead suggested they spend time together as a family. She cooked Alexander's favorite dinner, complimented his work at the shop, even hinted at intimacy for the first time in months. Alexander played along, curious to see how far she'd go to rebuild what she'd thrown away. The performance was fascinating, a masterclass in manipulation by someone who'd clearly done this before. Every smile was calculated, every touch strategic, every word chosen for maximum impact. If he hadn't known the truth, he might have been fooled. Sunday evening brought the call Alexander had been anticipating. Malcolm Porter, drunk and desperate, had apparently decided Camille needed to share his misery. "Your husband," Malcolm slurred into Camille's phone while Alexander listened on the extension Derek had installed. "There's something wrong about all this. Too convenient. Too coordinated. Someone's been playing games." "You're being paranoid," Camille replied, but her voice carried uncertainty. "Sometimes bad luck just compounds. This isn't luck. This is warfare. And I think your loving husband might be smarter than either of us gave him credit for." Alexander smiled in the darkness of his garage office. Malcolm Porter might be a failure as a businessman and a human being, but his survival instincts were finally kicking in. Unfortunately for him, the warning was coming far too late. Monday morning brought the endgame into clear focus. Camille approached Alexander with an offer that revealed both her desperation and her complete misunderstanding of the man she'd betrayed. "I've been thinking," she said, using the same tone she'd once employed to convince him to buy her expensive jewelry. "Maybe we should renew our wedding vows. 16 years is a major milestone. We could have a ceremony, invite everyone, really celebrate what we've built together." Alexander looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. The woman he'd loved had either never existed or had died so gradually he hadn't noticed the decay. "That's an interesting idea," he said finally. "But first, I think we need to have an honest conversation about what we've actually built." Something in his tone made Camille's smile falter. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's time to stop pretending, Camille. Both of us." The color drained from her face, but she maintained her facade with impressive determination. "I don't know what you're talking about." Alexander pulled out his phone and showed her one of Derek's photos. Camille and Malcolm entering the Driscoll, her hand on his arm, their body language unmistakably intimate. "Yes," he said quietly. "You do." For a moment, the mask slipped completely. Camille's face cycled through shock, fear, anger, and calculation before settling on an expression Alexander had never seen before: cold, predatory assessment. "How long have you known?" she asked, abandoning all pretense. "Long enough to understand exactly who you are. And what do you plan to do about it?" Alexander smiled. And for the first time in weeks, it was genuine. "I'm going to show you what happens when you betray someone who actually fights back." The war was over. Camille just didn't know it yet. Chapter 7. The Airport Revelation. Sunday morning arrived with the crisp certainty of Judgment Day. Alexander Todd stood in his kitchen, drinking coffee and watching his wife perform the final act of her deception with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a fascinating but ultimately doomed species. "Are you sure you can't come pick me up?" Camille asked, her voice carrying the perfect note of disappointed affection. "I know you hate airport runs, but I'll have been away for 3 days. I'll miss you. 3 days." The supposed charity conference in San Antonio that would really be spent with Malcolm Porter in his desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his business empire. Except Malcolm didn't know that his empire's destruction was only the opening move in a much larger game. "Sorry, sweetheart," Alexander replied, his tone apologetic. "I promised Emma I'd help her with that history project. You know how she gets when I break promises." It was a calculated reminder of parental responsibility, designed to twist the knife of guilt just enough to keep Camille off balance. The fact that it worked, her wince was barely perceptible but unmistakable, told Alexander everything he needed to know about her remaining capacity for shame. "Of course," Camille said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Family first. I'll just take a taxi." "Actually," Alexander said, as if the thought had just occurred to him, "Wayne offered to pick you up. He's got some business at the airport anyway. I hope that's okay." Camille's face went carefully blank. She'd met Wayne Gates exactly twice, both times at family barbecues where he'd been politely cordial but had clearly taken her measure with a shrewd assessment of a successful businessman. She dismissed him as another of Alexander's boring relatives, which showed how poorly she understood the dynamics of the family she'd married into. "That's very thoughtful," she managed, "but I wouldn't want to inconvenience him." No inconvenience at all. He was happy to help. What Alexander didn't mention was that Wayne's business at the airport involved delivering the final piece of information that would complete Malcolm Porter's destruction, or that Wayne's offer to pick up Camille had nothing to do with family courtesy and everything to do with ensuring she experienced the full impact of what was about to unfold. Camille left for her fake conference Friday morning with the same performance of affection she'd perfected over the past few weeks. She kissed Alexander goodbye, hugged Emma with theatrical warmth, and made appropriate noises about missing them both terribly. Alexander watched her drive away, then called Derek. "Is everything in place?" "Like clockwork." Porter thinks he's meeting her to discuss their future plans. He's got no idea what's actually waiting for him. What was waiting for Malcolm Porter was the culmination of 3 weeks of psychological warfare. His business empire was destroyed, his reputation was in ruins, and his financial future was non-existent. But Alexander had saved the final humiliation for last. Wayne's contacts in Houston had arranged for Malcolm's ex-wives to receive anonymous tips about his current romantic entanglements. Not illegal information, just enough detail to pique their curiosity and suggest they might want to examine whether Malcolm had been hiding assets during their respective divorce proceedings. By Friday afternoon, Malcolm Porter was facing not just bankruptcy, but potential fraud investigations from 2 different civil attorneys representing the women he'd screwed over financially while screwing them over personally. Derek's surveillance from the Driscoll painted a picture of a man in complete freefall. Malcolm had aged years in the past 3 weeks, his usual polished appearance replaced by the rumpled desperation of someone who'd stopped caring about maintaining facades. His confidence had evaporated along with his fortune, leaving behind a bitter, angry shell of a man looking for someone to blame. Camille's reaction to seeing her lover's transformation was everything Alexander had hoped for. According to Derek's audio surveillance, their reunion was awkward and tense, full of recriminations and desperate planning that went nowhere because there was nowhere to go. "We need to be smart about this," Camille said during their Friday evening dinner, her voice tight with stress. "Maybe we should wait until things settle down before making any major decisions." "Settle down?" Malcolm's laugh was harsh. "My life is over, Camille. My business is destroyed, my reputation is shot, and now my ex-wives are coming after me for fraud. There is no settling down. There's only damage control. Then maybe we should—" "What? Pretend this never happened? Go back to our respective spouses and hope nobody notices?" Malcolm's voice turned vicious. "That might work for you, princess, but I've got nothing left to go back to." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Malcolm demanding that Camille leave Alexander immediately and Camille realizing that her wealthy lover was now a liability rather than an asset. By Saturday, they were barely speaking, their weekend of passion having devolved into bitter mutual recrimination. Sunday morning brought the final act. Wayne Gates arrived at Austin Bergstrom International Airport at 2 p.m., precisely 30 minutes before Camille's flight was scheduled to land. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Alexander Todd, wearing his best shirt and a smile that could have cut glass. "You sure about this?" Wayne asked as they walked through the terminal. "Once she sees you here, there's no going back." "There's been no going back since the day she chose to lie to my face," Alexander replied. "Today she just learns what that choice cost her." They positioned themselves near the arrival gate. Wayne casual in his expensive suit, Alexander deliberately visible in the crowd. At 2:47 p.m., passengers from the San Antonio flight began emerging from the jetway. Camille appeared at 2:52 p.m., looking tired and strained, but still maintaining the careful composure she'd cultivated for her fake conference story. She scanned the crowd, clearly expecting to see Wayne alone. Instead, she saw her husband. The impact was immediate and total. Camille's face went through the now familiar cycle of shock, fear, and calculation, but this time the calculation part failed to engage. She stood frozen in the flow of departing passengers, her facade cracking like ice under pressure. Alexander walked up to her with the same calm confidence he brought to every important moment in his life. When he spoke, his voice was loud enough for the people around them to hear, a deliberate choice that would prevent Camille from attempting damage control through immediate lies. "Hello, darling," he said, his tone warm and loving in a way that made the words themselves feel like weapons. "How was San Antonio? I hope the charity conference was everything you expected." Camille's mouth opened and closed without sound. Around them, other travelers continued their journeys, oblivious to the domestic drama unfolding in their midst. She started, then stopped, clearly struggling to remember which lie she was supposed to be maintaining. "Because," Alexander continued, still smiling, "I have some interesting news about your friend Malcolm Porter. It seems his business troubles have taken an unexpected turn. Wayne here has been following the situation closely." Wayne stepped forward with the grave expression of a man delivering unfortunate news. "I'm afraid Mr. Porter was arrested this morning on fraud charges. Something about hiding assets from his ex-wives during their divorce proceedings. The FBI was quite thorough in their investigation. It was a masterful performance. The fraud charges were real. Wayne's careful manipulation had ensured that Malcolm's past financial deceptions finally caught up with him. The arrest had happened exactly as Wayne described, timed perfectly to coincide with Camille's expected return from her fake conference." Camille's face went white. I don't understand. I don't know anyone named Malcolm Porter." Alexander's smile widened. "Of course you don't, sweetheart. Just like you don't know why your phone's been pinging cell towers at the Driscoll Hotel for the past 3 weeks. Just like you don't know why our joint account shows charges at restaurants and hotels you've never mentioned visiting." The lies died in Camille's throat. She looked around desperately, perhaps hoping for escape, but found only the steady gaze of her husband and the amused interest of strangers who were beginning to realize they were witnessing something more dramatic than a typical airport pickup. "Alex," she whispered, "I can explain." "No," Alexander said quietly, "you can't. Because the time for explanations was 3 weeks ago when I gave you the chance to tell me the truth. The time for explanations was when I asked directly if anything was wrong in our marriage, and you lied to my face." He stepped closer, close enough that only she could hear his next words. "The time for explanations was before you chose to betray the only person in your life who actually loved you unconditionally. Now it's time for consequences." Camille's composure finally shattered completely. Tears began streaming down her face, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streaks as the full weight of her situation finally hit her. "Please," she sobbed. "Please, Alex. I made a mistake. I can fix this. We can fix this." Alexander looked at his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor that needed to be removed. "No, Camille," he said simply. "We can't." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the airport with her suitcase full of lies and her future full of consequences she'd never bothered to consider. Behind him, Wayne fell in his step with the satisfaction of a job well done. Think she gets it now? Wayne asked. She's starting to, Alexander replied. But we're not finished yet. Because while Camille was learning that her affair had cost her everything she'd taken for granted, Alexander Todd was preparing to teach her the difference between losing a marriage and losing a war. And this had always been a war. Chapter 8. The Complete Destruction. Monday morning brought the kind of clarity that only comes from total commitment to a course of action. Alexander Todd sat in his lawyer's office, signing papers that would formalize what had already become inevitable. The divorce filing was just paperwork. The real work had been completed at the airport 2 days earlier. John Schaefer reviewed the documents with the thoroughness of a man who understood the stakes involved. "This is comprehensive," he said, his tone professionally neutral. "You're asking for primary custody, the house, the business, and essentially leaving her with half the liquid assets and her car." "Texas is a community property state," Alexander replied. "I'm being generous. The adultery evidence certainly supports your position on custody and asset division. These surveillance photos and financial records paint a very clear picture." John paused, studying his client's face. "Alex, I have to ask, are you sure you want to be this aggressive? Sometimes a more collaborative approach can save money and emotional energy." Alexander thought about Camille's performance at the airport, her desperate attempts at manipulation even when caught red-handed, her complete lack of genuine remorse for what she'd done to their family. "I'm sure." The papers were filed that afternoon. By 4 p.m., Camille Todd was officially being served with divorce proceedings that would strip away the comfortable life she'd been so eager to betray. Derek surveillance had continued through the weekend, documenting Camille's return to the house and her increasingly frantic attempts to contact Malcolm Porter. What she discovered was that her lover was no longer taking her calls. Malcolm, facing federal fraud charges and the complete destruction of his business empire, had apparently decided that his married girlfriend was a liability he couldn't afford. "She tried calling him 17 times yesterday," Derek reported. "He's not responding, and based on what my sources in Houston are telling me, he's got bigger problems than a discarded mistress." Malcolm Porter's arrest had been thorough and public. The FBI had executed search warrants on his office, his home, and his bank accounts, seizing records that documented years of financial fraud perpetrated against his ex-wives and business partners. Wayne's careful manipulation had ensured that Malcolm's past crimes finally received the attention they deserved, but the timing and scope of the investigation had been orchestrated to maximize both legal consequences and public humiliation. "He's looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison," Wayne reported during their Monday evening meeting. "His lawyers are talking about a plea deal, but the prosecutor isn't interested in anything less than full restitution plus jail time." "Malcolm Porter is finished," Alexander nodded, feeling the satisfaction of a craftsman who delivered exactly what his customer had ordered. Malcolm Porter hadn't just been defeated. He'd been obliterated so completely that he'd never be able to threaten another marriage or destroy another family. But the campaign wasn't over yet. Tuesday brought Camille's first real attempt at fighting back. She hired Caroline Klein, one of Austin's more aggressive divorce attorneys, and filed a countersuit claiming psychological abuse and financial manipulation. The strategy was transparent. Paint Alexander as a controlling husband who'd driven her to seek comfort elsewhere. John Schaefer's response was swift and devastating. Within hours, he'd filed a motion to dismiss the countersuit, accompanied by a comprehensive packet of evidence that included the surveillance photos, financial records, and audio recordings that documented Camille's affair in excruciating detail. "She's claiming you were emotionally abusive," John explained over the phone. "Her lawyer's arguing that your discovery of the affair was the result of stalking behavior that constitutes harassment. And your response? That a spouse has every right to investigate suspicious behavior, and that documenting adultery in public places doesn't constitute stalking under Texas law. Plus, we've got her on record lying repeatedly about her whereabouts and activities. No judge is going to be sympathetic to someone who got caught cheating." By Wednesday, Camille's strategy had shifted to direct confrontation. She showed up at Alexander's shop during the lunch hour, clearly intending to have a public scene that might generate sympathy or at least create witnesses to whatever narrative she was trying to construct. She'd underestimated both Alexander's preparation and his employees' loyalty. "You can't do this to me," Camille announced as she stormed into the shop's main bay, her voice carrying the kind of righteous indignation that only comes from someone who's never faced real consequences for their actions. 16 years of marriage, Alexander. 16 years, and you're just going to throw it away? Alexander looked up from the Harley engine he was rebuilding, his hands steady as he continued his work. Around the shop, his employees had stopped what they were doing to watch, but their faces showed support for their boss rather than sympathy for his dramatic wife. "I didn't throw anything away, Camille," Alexander said quietly. "You did. I'm just dealing with the aftermath. I made one mistake. One mistake, and you're trying to destroy my entire life." Alexander set down his wrench and looked at his wife with the clinical interest of a man examining a specimen under a microscope. "One mistake? You've been lying to me for 3 months. You've been stealing money from our joint account to fund your affair. You've been using our daughter as cover for your deception. Which part of that was just one mistake?" Camille's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She'd clearly expected this confrontation to go differently. Perhaps she'd imagined Alexander would be willing to discuss reconciliation in front of witnesses, or maybe she'd hoped to provoke him into saying something she could use against him legally. Instead, she found herself facing a man who'd planned for this moment as carefully as he planned everything else. "You're being vindictive," she accused. "This isn't about justice. This is about your ego." Alexander's laugh was genuinely amused. "My ego? Camille, my ego wasn't the one that needed validation from a married woman's attention. My ego wasn't the one that thought it could have a secret affair without consequences. And my ego isn't the one that's about to lose everything because it couldn't appreciate what it already had." The words hit their target. Camille's composure cracked, revealing the desperate woman beneath the righteous facade. "I can take Emma," she said, her voice turning vicious. "I'm her mother. No court is going to. Take her where?" Alexander interrupted. "To the apartment you can't afford? To the job you don't have? To the new life you were planning with a man who's about to spend the next decade in federal prison?" The shop had gone completely silent. Alexander's employees were watching the exchange with the fascination of people witnessing a car crash in slow motion. "Emma needs stability," Alexander continued, his voice never rising above conversational level. "She needs a parent who puts her first instead of using her as a convenient excuse for deception. She needs a home that isn't built on lies." Camille opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to realize that anything she said would only make things worse. Instead, she turned and stalked out of the shop, her exit less dramatic than her entrance, but far more final. "Damn, boss," Buddy Cooper said into the silence that followed. "That was brutal." "No," Alexander replied, picking up his wrench and returning to work. "That was justice." Thursday brought news that Malcolm Porter had accepted a plea deal, 7 years in federal prison and full restitution to his victims, which would keep him financially ruined even after his release. Wayne's network had ensured that Malcolm's legal troubles would follow him for the rest of his life, making it impossible for him to rebuild the empire he'd lost or prey on other vulnerable marriages. Friday brought Camille's final capitulation. Through her lawyer, she agreed to Alexander's divorce terms without further contest. She would receive half the liquid assets, her car, and supervised visitation with Emma until the teenager turned 18 and could make her own decisions about the relationship. Alexander signed the papers with the same methodical care he brought to every important task, officially ending a marriage that had really died 3 weeks earlier in the lobby of the Driscoll Hotel. "It's done," John Schaefer announced. "She's out of your life." But Alexander Todd knew better. Camille would never be completely out of his life. She was Emma's mother, after all, and Emma deserved the chance to maintain that relationship if she chose to. What was out of his life was the illusion that love and loyalty were enough to protect against betrayal. What was out of his life was the naive belief that good faith would always be met with good faith. What remained was the harder knowledge that some battles can only be won by someone willing to fight harder, plan better, and strike more precisely than their enemies. Malcolm Porter and Camille Todd had learned that lesson the hard way. Alexander Todd had learned it just in time. Chapter 9. The Price of Victory. 6 months later, Alexander Todd stood in his shop's main bay, watching Emma work on the carburetor of a 1967 Mustang with a focused intensity she'd inherited from him. At 15 now, she'd grown into someone who understood that actions had consequences and that trust, once broken, required more than words to rebuild. "Dad," she said without looking up from her work, "Mom called again. She wants to take me to dinner this weekend." Alexander wiped his hands on a shop rag, considering his response. Camille had been persistent in her attempts to rebuild her relationship with Emma, but their daughter had proven surprisingly resistant to manipulation once she'd learned the full truth about the divorce. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Emma's hands stilled on the wrench. "I don't know. Part of me wants to give her another chance, but every time we talk, she acts like what happened was just some kind of misunderstanding, like you overreacted or something. And what do you think?" "I think she made choices, and choices have consequences." Emma's voice carried a maturity that sometimes startled Alexander. "I think she's trying to rewrite history because she doesn't like how the story ended." Alexander nodded, proud of his daughter's clarity. Emma had initially been devastated by the divorce, but as the truth had emerged, her anger had focused where it belonged, on the parent who'd chosen deception over honesty, excitement over stability. The past 6 months had been a period of reconstruction for both of them. Alexander had sold the family house, too many memories, too many rooms that echoed with Camille's lies, and bought a smaller place closer to Emma's school. The shop had expanded, adding 2 new employees and taking on more custom work as word spread about Alexander's craftsmanship and integrity. Wayne Gates had become a regular presence in their lives, his business success creating opportunities for Alexander's shop that had transformed it from a modest garage into one of Austin's premier custom motorcycle destinations. Success, Alexander had learned, was the best revenge. It proved that life could not only continue after betrayal but actually improve. "Your call," Alexander told his daughter. "But remember, you don't owe anyone a relationship just because they're family. Family is earned, not just inherited." Emma smiled, the expression transforming her face from serious teenager to the happy child she'd once been. "I'll think about it." Derek Hull appeared in the shop's doorway, carrying a manila envelope that Alexander recognized immediately. Monthly surveillance updates had become routine, not because Alexander didn't trust the legal system, but because he understood that some people never learn from consequences. "The quarterly report," Derek said, handing over the envelope. "Interesting developments." Alexander opened the envelope and reviewed the contents with professional interest. Malcolm Porter was 8 months into his federal sentence, apparently adapting poorly to prison life. His attempts to maintain contact with former business associates had been unsuccessful, and his prospects for rebuilding his empire upon release were non-existent. More interesting was the information about Camille. She'd moved to a small apartment in Dallas, taken a job at a local art gallery, and was reportedly dating a middle manager at an insurance company. A significant step down from her previous standards, but perhaps more realistic given her new circumstances. "She's been telling people that you destroyed her life out of spite," Derek reported. Claims the whole thing was an overreaction to a brief indiscretion. Alexander smiled, unsurprised. Some people were incapable of accepting responsibility for their actions, preferring to cast themselves as victims rather than acknowledge their role in their own destruction. "What about the insurance guy?" "Divorced, 2 kids, decent income, but nothing spectacular. Seems like a normal guy who doesn't know what he's getting into." Alexander felt a moment of sympathy for the unknown man who was about to learn about Camille's capacity for deception. But sympathy had limits, and some lessons could only be learned through experience. That evening, Alexander and Emma shared dinner at their kitchen table, discussing her plans for summer vacation and his ideas for expanding the shop's restoration services. It was a comfortable routine they'd developed, just the 2 of them, building something honest and sustainable from the wreckage of their previous life. "I've been thinking," Emma said as they cleaned up after dinner, "about what happened with Mom and everything." Alexander paused in loading the dishwasher. Emma rarely brought up the divorce directly, preferring to process her feelings privately rather than burden him with teenage emotional drama. "What about it? I used to think you were kind of boring," Emma said, her tone carefully neutral. "Like, compared to some of my friends' parents, you seem too careful, too predictable. And now I think careful is good. Predictable is good. I think a lot of people could use more boring in their lives." Alexander felt something tight in his chest loosen for the first time in months. His daughter's approval meant more than all the business success and legal victories combined. "Thanks, Em. That means a lot." Besides, Emma continued with a grin that reminded him painfully of the woman Camille had been before she'd chosen betrayal over loyalty. "You're only boring until someone crosses you. Then you're terrifying." Alexander laughed, genuinely amused. "I prefer to think of it as thorough." The phone rang as they finished cleaning up, interrupting their conversation. Alexander glanced at the caller ID and felt his good mood evaporate slightly. "Camille's number." "It's her," he told Emma. "Take it," Emma said. "I'll go finish my homework." Alexander waited until his daughter had disappeared upstairs before answering. "Hello, Camille." "Alex." His ex-wife's voice carried the same careful control he remembered from their marriage, but there was an underlying desperation that hadn't been there before. "I was hoping we could talk." "About what?" "About Emma. About us. About maybe finding a way to move forward that doesn't involve so much anger." Alexander leaned against the kitchen counter, looking out at the small backyard where Emma had set up a punching bag to work out her own frustrations. His daughter was stronger than her mother in ways that mattered, more honest about her emotions, and more willing to face uncomfortable truths. "There's no us, Camille. There's Emma, and there's the legal agreement we signed. That's all. It doesn't have to be that way. We were married for 16 years, Alex. That has to count for something." "It counted for everything," Alexander replied quietly, "until you decided it counted for nothing." Silence on the line. Then Camille's voice, smaller now. "I made mistakes. I know that. But the punishment doesn't fit the crime. You destroyed everything. My marriage, my home, my future. Don't you think I've paid enough?" Alexander considered the question with the same analytical approach he brought to diagnosing engine problems. Had Camille paid enough? Her lover was in federal prison. Her comfortable life was gone. Her daughter barely spoke to her, and her future prospects were significantly diminished. From an objective standpoint, the consequences were proportional to the betrayal. She'd risked everything for temporary excitement and had lost everything as a result. Justice, by any reasonable measure, had been served. But Alexander Todd had learned that justice and mercy were different things, and mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. "No," he said simply. "You haven't. How can you say that? How can you be so cold?" "Because you still don't understand what you actually did," Alexander replied. "You think this was about sex or excitement or some kind of midlife crisis. But it wasn't. It was about choosing to destroy the trust that held our family together. It was about deciding that your temporary happiness was more important than our daughter's stability. It was about looking me in the eye every day for 3 months and lying without hesitation." He paused, organizing his thoughts with characteristic precision. "You didn't just cheat on me, Camille. You made me complicit in my own betrayal by forcing me to live a lie I didn't even know I was living. You turned our home into a stage set for your deception and our marriage into a cover story for your affair. So no, I don't think you've paid enough. I don't think you understand enough to have paid enough." The silence that followed was so complete Alexander wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Camille's voice barely audible. "I loved you." "No," Alexander said, his tone gentle but implacable. "You loved the security I provided. You loved the life I built for us. You loved the image of stability I represented. But you never loved me enough to be honest with me. And that's the only kind of love that actually matters." He ended the call and turned off his phone, not interested in whatever response Camille might offer. Some conversations could only end one way, and this one had been over before it began. Upstairs, he found Emma at her desk, supposedly doing homework, but clearly having listened to at least part of the conversation. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," Alexander replied, and meant it. "We both are." Emma nodded, returning to her work with the satisfied expression of someone whose world made sense again. Alexander Todd had learned many things over the past year. He'd learned that trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired through words or gestures. He'd learned that some people would always choose the easy lie over the difficult truth. He'd learned that loyalty had to be mutual to have any meaning. Most importantly, he learned that some victories came at a price, but some defeats cost everything. The price of his victory had been a marriage, a family structure, and the comfortable illusion that good intentions were enough to protect against betrayal. The cost of defeat would have been his self-respect, his daughter's trust, and his future's foundation. It hadn't been a difficult choice. Alexander Todd was many things: craftsman, father, strategist, but he was not a man who accepted defeat when victory was possible. Camille and Malcolm Porter had learned that lesson thoroughly. Others, he hoped, would learn it from their example. Because some teachers, Alexander had discovered, taught their lessons through demonstration rather than instruction. And the demonstration was complete. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Vincent Crawford had built his life like he built his custom homes, with precision, patience, and an unforgiving eye for structural integrity. At 42, he owned Crawford Construction, the most respected building company in Millbrook County. His calloused hands could frame a house or close a $1 million deal with equal expertise. But it was his mind that made him truly dangerous, methodical, calculating, and utterly without mercy when crossed. His marriage to Rebecca had been his greatest project. 15 years of careful construction, from their college romance at State University to the sprawling colonial they called home. She'd been studying education while he earned his business degree, both dreaming of the American ideal. Vince had provided it all: the house with the white picket fence, the successful business, their son Dylan, who was now 16 and showed promise as a linebacker. Rebecca taught third grade at Millbrook Elementary, beloved by parents and students alike. She volunteered at the local animal shelter, organized charity drives, and baked cookies for school fundraisers. To the outside world, they were the perfect family. Vince had believed it too, until 3 months ago when a random glance at Rebecca's phone shattered 15 years of trust. The text was simple: "Can't wait to feel you inside me again. Tyler." Vincent Crawford was not a man who broke. He was a man who demolished others with surgical precision. Tyler Hoffman was Rebecca's yoga instructor, 12 years younger, with the kind of lean physique that came from teaching hot yoga 5 days a week. Vince had met him twice at Rebecca's studio events, a soft-spoken man with doe eyes and an easy smile. The kind of man who probably cried during romantic comedies and wrote poetry about chakras. That night, while Rebecca slept beside him, Vince lay awake staring at the ceiling. His marriage was over. That much was certain. But divorce was for ordinary men who let emotions cloud their judgment. Vincent Crawford was extraordinary, and extraordinary men demanded extraordinary retribution. By morning, he had the skeleton of a plan. Chapter 2. Reconnaissance. Vince approached his wife's destruction like any construction project: thorough planning, quality materials, and expert execution. Over the next 2 weeks, he became a student of his wife's affair while maintaining the facade of the devoted husband. Rebecca had grown careless in her confidence. She deleted texts but left her laptop logged into cloud storage. Her schedule claimed yoga classes 3 times a week, but Vince's discreet surveillance revealed she was meeting Tyler at his apartment above the studio for 2-hour sessions that had nothing to do with downward-facing dog. Tyler lived alone, drove a beat-up Honda Civic, and struggled to pay his rent teaching yoga and working part-time at an organic juice bar. His social media revealed a history of relationships with married women. Apparently, Rebecca wasn't his first student to receive private instruction. But Vince's real discovery came when he followed Tyler to a meeting with Rebecca at a coffee shop downtown. Hidden behind a newspaper, he watched them hold hands across the table like teenagers, Rebecca's wedding ring noticeably absent from her finger. "I hate lying to Dylan," Rebecca whispered, her voice carrying in the quiet cafe. "He keeps asking why I'm gone so much." "Baby, after the divorce, we could be a real family," Tyler replied, squeezing her hand. "Your kid will adjust. Kids always do. Your kid." The casual dismissal of his son ignited something cold and lethal in Vince's chest. These people had plotted not just to destroy his marriage, but to dismantle his family, to make his son collateral damage in their selfish fantasy. That evening, Vince sat at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, designing the blueprint for their destruction. Unlike his houses, this construction would leave nothing standing. Dylan walked into the kitchen, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. "Dad, you okay? You've been quiet lately." Vince looked at his son, Rebecca's eyes, but his own stubborn jawline, the product of their union, now caught in the crossfire of her betrayal. "Just work stuff, son. Nothing you need to worry about." But Dylan was perceptive, like his father. "Are you and Mom having problems?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Vince could have lied, could have protected his son's innocence a little longer. Instead, he chose to prepare him for the war to come. "Dylan, sit down. There are some things about your mother you need to know." Chapter 3, The First Strike. Vincent's initial move was subtle but devastating. Rebecca prided herself on being irreplaceable at Millbrook Elementary, but Vince knew that small-town school districts lived and died by their reputations. A whisper in the right ear could topple kingdoms. He started with Margaret Winters, the school board president whose husband had hired Crawford Construction to build their dream retirement home. Over coffee and blueprints, Vince casually mentioned seeing Rebecca's car at unusual locations during school hours. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said with practiced concern, "but as a taxpayer, I'd hate to think our teachers weren't fully committed to their students." Margaret's eyebrows rose with interest. She was a woman who collected gossip like some people collected stamps. Within a week, Rebecca faced her first administrative review in 10 years of teaching. Suddenly, her every move was scrutinized. Her afternoon dental appointments and personal days were questioned. The pressure mounted until she was forced to end her afternoon meetings with Tyler, relegating their affair to stolen moments after school. But Vince's masterstroke came through his connections in the local business community. Tyler's yoga studio rented space in a building owned by Frank Morrison, whose construction projects had made Crawford Construction very wealthy over the years. A quiet conversation about concerns regarding the moral character of certain tenants led to Tyler receiving a 30-day notice to vacate. When Rebecca came home that evening, red-eyed and stressed, Vince played the concerned husband perfectly. "Bad day, honey?" He poured her a glass of wine, the same vintage they'd shared on their anniversary. "Just word drama," she lied, accepting the glass gratefully. "Sometimes I think people in this town have nothing better to do than create problems." "Small towns," Vince agreed sympathetically. "Everyone's business becomes everyone else's entertainment." Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text. Vince watched her face crumple as she read Tyler's message about losing the studio. She excused herself to the bathroom, where Vince knew she was probably calling her lover to console him. Dylan looked up from his homework at the kitchen table. "Mom seems upset." "She'll be fine," Vince replied, sipping his wine. Sometimes life just has a way of putting people exactly where they belong. His son studied him with intelligent eyes. "Dad, are you getting divorced?" The directness of the question caught Vince off guard, but not the wisdom behind it. Dylan had inherited his father's analytical mind. "Would that bother you?" "I don't know," Dylan answered honestly, "but I think Mom's been lying about something for a while now. And you've been different too." Colder. Vince set down his wine glass and truly looked at his son. At 16, Dylan was no longer a child to be protected with comfortable lies. He was becoming a man, and men faced hard truths. "Your mother is having an affair," Vince said simply. Dylan's face didn't change, but Vince saw his hands tighten into fists on the table. "I know. How long have you known?" "A couple months. I saw a text on her phone by accident." Dylan's voice was steady, but Vince could hear the pain underneath. What are you going to do? I'm going to make sure justice is served, Vince replied. The question is, what are you going to do? Dylan looked toward the bathroom where Rebecca was still on her hushed phone call, then back at his father. What do you need me to do? In that moment, Vince saw himself reflected in his son's eyes. The same cold calculation, the same understanding that betrayal demanded a price. Some men might have felt proud. Vincent Crawford felt something far more dangerous: validation. Chapter 4. The Web Titans. 2 weeks after Tyler lost his studio, Vince implemented Phase 2 of his plan. He learned that Tyler's backup plan was to teach private classes in clients' homes while searching for a new location. Through a shell company, Vince began systematically contacting Tyler's client base, offering discounted yoga classes through a new instructor at a legitimate studio across town. Within days, Tyler's income stream dwindled to almost nothing. Desperate, he took a job delivering food for DoorDash to pay his bills, humiliating for someone who'd once commanded $50 an hour for private sessions. But Vince's cruelest cut came through social engineering. He created a fake dating profile using photos of an attractive woman named Jessica and began flirting with Tyler online. Desperate for both ego validation and money, Tyler quickly arranged to meet Jessica for drinks at Flanagan, Millbrook's most visible restaurant. On the appointed evening, Tyler sat alone at the bar for 3 hours, ordering increasingly expensive drinks while waiting for a woman who would never come. The bartender, coincidentally, was married to one of Rebecca's teaching colleagues. By the next morning, half the town knew that Rebecca's yoga instructor had been stood up by a mysterious woman he'd met online. The humiliation was perfect. Tyler's reputation as a local Lothario crumbled overnight, replaced by whispers about the desperate man ordering drink after drink while obsessively checking his phone. Rebecca tried to comfort Tyler, but their relationship began showing strain. Their secret meetings became arguments about his mounting problems, his lack of money, his inability to find a new studio. The passionate affair was becoming a burden. Vince observed it all with the satisfaction of a master craftsman watching his creation take shape. He varied his routine just enough to avoid suspicion while maintaining surveillance. Some evenings he worked late at construction sites. Others he claimed client dinners or supplier meetings. Rebecca never questioned his schedule. She was too preoccupied with her own deceptions. Dylan proved to be an invaluable ally. At 16, he was practically invisible to adults, able to observe and report without raising suspicion. He confirmed Tyler's evening work schedule, Rebecca's new habit of crying in her car after school, and most importantly, their increasingly frequent arguments when they thought no one was listening. She told him she was thinking about calling off the divorce. Dylan reported one evening while helping Vince organize blueprints in his home office. He got angry, said she was leading him on. And what did she say? That she never promised him anything, that this was all moving too fast. Dylan's voice carried no emotion, but Vince could see the anger simmering underneath. He called her a tease. Vince looked up from his papers. How did that make you feel? Like I wanted to break his face, Dylan admitted. But then I remembered what you said about patience. What did I say? That the best revenge is the kind that destroys everything they care about, not just what they can see. Pride swelled in Vince's chest. His son was learning the most important lesson of all, that true power came not from emotional outbursts, but from strategic thinking. That night, Vince lay in bed beside his wife, listening to her shallow breathing and planning his next move. Rebecca stirred, reaching for him in her sleep, and Vince felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even disgust. She had become an obstacle to be removed, nothing more. His phone buzzed with a text from his private investigator. Found something interesting about Hoffman's background. Call me. Vince smiled in the darkness. Phase 3 was about to begin. Chapter 5. Deeper Cuts. The information from his private investigator was better than Vince had hoped. Tyler Hoffman wasn't just a yoga instructor who preyed on married women. He was Tyler Hoffman, who'd been arrested for assault 3 years ago in Denver before moving to Millbrook. The charges had been dropped when the victim declined to press charges, but the arrest record remained. More intriguingly, the victim had been a married woman whose husband had discovered their affair. Tyler had apparently confronted the husband in a parking lot, resulting in a fight that left the husband with a broken nose and Tyler in handcuffs. Vince studied the police report with the interest of a scholar examining ancient texts. Tyler Hoffman had a history of violence when cornered, a useful piece of information for the right situation. But the truly valuable discovery was Tyler's pattern of behavior. In Denver, he targeted 3 different married women over 2 years, always promising them new lives while systematically isolating them from their support systems. He was a predator who'd refined his methods, and Rebecca was simply his latest mark. Armed with this knowledge, Vince crafted his most insidious attack yet. He arranged for copies of Tyler's arrest record to anonymously find their way to the remaining yoga studios in town, effectively blacklisting him from employment. He also sent copies to several of Tyler's former clients, along with a carefully worded note expressing concern for their safety. The reaction was swift and merciless. Tyler's reputation, already damaged by the failed date at Flanagan, collapsed entirely. Parents pulled their children from his classes, women canceled private sessions, and the organic juice bar fired him within days. Rebecca arrived home from school that Friday looking haggard and defeated. She'd been crying. Her makeup couldn't completely hide the evidence. "Tyler's thinking about leaving town," she announced over dinner, her voice carefully controlled. Dylan looked up from his meatloaf. "Where would he go?" "He's got some friends in Portland. Says there's nothing left for him here." Vince chewed thoughtfully. "That's probably for the best. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what a person needs." Rebecca's eyes flashed with something between grief and anger. "You don't understand. He's a good person who's just had some bad luck." "Bad luck," Vince repeated slowly, "or bad choices?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Dylan continued eating, but Vince could see his son's awareness of the undercurrents in the conversation. "Sometimes good people make mistakes," Rebecca said defensively. "And sometimes," Vince replied, "people's true natures eventually surface, no matter how well they hide them." That night, Rebecca received a call that sent her into hysterics. Tyler had been arrested for drunk driving after rear-ending a family of 4 at a traffic light. No one was seriously injured, but Tyler's blood alcohol level was twice the legal limit, and there were drug paraphernalia in his car. What Rebecca didn't know was that Vince had orchestrated the entire incident. A few drinks bought for a desperate man at the right bar, a carefully timed call reporting an erratic driver, and Tyler's self-destructive tendencies did the rest. "I have to help him," Rebecca declared, grabbing her purse. "He needs bail money." "No," Vince said simply. Rebecca froze at the door. "What?" "I said no. You're not going anywhere." "You can't tell me what to do, Vince." "He's my friend." "He's your lover," Vince corrected, his voice deadly calm. "And you're my wife. And you're not going anywhere." The mask was finally slipping, and Rebecca could see the cold fury in her husband's eyes. Dylan watched from the kitchen doorway, silent and alert. "Vince, sit down, Rebecca. We need to talk." Chapter 6, Declarations of War. Rebecca sat across from Vince in their living room, the same space where they'd planned Dylan's birthday parties and discussed mortgage refinancing. Now it felt like a courtroom, with Vince as both judge and executioner. "I know about Tyler," Vince said without preamble. "I've known for months." Rebecca's face went white. "Vince, I can explain." "No explanations. I want you to understand something very clearly. Your affair is over. Your boyfriend is going to prison for DUI and drug possession, and you're going to file for divorce." "What?" Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "You heard me. You're going to file for divorce, and you're going to cite irreconcilable differences. You're going to ask for minimal custody of Dylan, and you're going to accept whatever settlement I offer." Rebecca found her voice. "You're insane if you think I'll just roll over and—" "Tyler Hoffman has a history of violence," Vince interrupted, sliding a folder across the coffee table. "Arrest records, restraining orders, 3 different women in Denver who will testify that he's unstable and dangerous. Do you really want Dylan exposed to that kind of influence?" Rebecca opened the folder with trembling hands, her face growing paler as she read. "You orchestrated all of this," she breathed. "The studio, his clients leaving, the arrest, all of it." "I protected my family," Vince corrected. From a predator who is using you to destroy our son's stability. Our son. Rebecca's voice turned sharp. Dylan barely speaks to me anymore. He looks at me like I'm a stranger. Because you are, Dylan said from the doorway. Both parents turned to see their 16-year-old son standing with his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold judgment. You're not the mother I thought I knew. Dylan, honey, you don't understand. I understand that you were screwing some loser while Dad worked his ass off to give us everything. I understand that you lied to my face every day for months. And I understand that you were planning to leave us for some guy who called me your kid like I was just baggage he'd have to deal with. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She hadn't known Dylan was aware of Tyler's casual dismissal. So here's what's going to happen. Vince continued, his voice businesslike. You're going to move out of this house by the end of the week. You're going to stay at your sister's in Cleveland until the divorce is finalized. You're going to accept supervised visitation with Dylan, if he wants it, and you're going to rebuild your pathetic life somewhere far away from here. And if I don't, Vince smiled, and Rebecca had never seen anything so cold in her life. Then I released Tyler's arrest record to the school board along with evidence of your affair. I provide testimony about your neglect of Dylan, your deception, your complete abandonment of your responsibilities as a mother and teacher. I destroy your career, your reputation, and any chance you have of seeing your son until he's 18. You can't. I could do anything I want, Rebecca. I have money, connections, and absolutely nothing left to lose. You made sure of that when you chose to betray everything we built together. Dylan stepped into the room. Mom, just take the deal. Please. Rebecca looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The boy who'd once crawled into her bed during thunderstorms was gone, replaced by a young man who watched her with his father's calculated coldness. When did I lose you? She whispered. When you decided Tyler was more important than your family. Dylan replied, without hesitation. That night, Rebecca packed her bags while Vince and Dylan sat in the kitchen playing chess. It was a surreal domesticity, father and son calmly planning their next moves while the woman who'd born and raised one of them gathered her belongings upstairs. She's going to try to fight this, Dylan said, moving his queen. She'll try, Vince agreed, studying the board. But she doesn't have the resources or the resolve for a prolonged battle. Check. Dylan smiled grimly and moved his king. What about Tyler? Tyler's going to be in jail for at least 6 months, longer if I can arrange for additional charges. By the time he gets out, Rebecca will realize that their great love affair was built on lies and fantasies. And then, Vince captured Dylan's rook with his bishop. Then they'll both learn what it really means to lose everything. Checkmate. As if summoned by their conversation, Rebecca appeared in the kitchen doorway with 2 suitcases. She looked at her husband and son playing chess as if they hadn't just destroyed her life, and something broke inside her. I loved you, she said to Vince. For 15 years, I loved you. Vince didn't look up from the chessboard. No, Rebecca, you love what I provided. There's a difference. She turned to Dylan, desperation in her eyes. And I love you, Dylan. No matter what happens, remember that I love you. Dylan finally looked at her, and Rebecca saw no forgiveness in his face. Love doesn't lie, Mom. Whatever you felt for us wasn't strong enough to keep you from betraying us. Rebecca Crawford walked out of her family's life that night, and neither her husband nor her son moved from the chessboard until her car disappeared down the street. Chapter 7. The Courtroom. 6 months later, Vincent Crawford stood in family court wearing his best suit and carrying his son's phone like a loaded weapon. The divorce proceedings had been brutal and public, exactly as Vince had intended. Rebecca's attempts to claim half their assets had been systematically demolished by evidence of her abandonment, adultery, and what Vince's lawyer had masterfully presented as willful destruction of the family unit. Tyler Hoffman had served 4 months in county jail and emerged to find his life in ruins. Rebecca had waited for him, moved to Cleveland to be closer to her sister, and tried to rebuild their relationship. But poverty, legal troubles, and the reality of their situation had poisoned whatever passion they'd once shared. Their great love affair had devolved into bitter arguments about money, blame, and the wreckage of their previous lives. Now, facing the final custody hearing, Rebecca had made one last desperate play. She'd hired a lawyer who specialized in parental alienation cases, claiming that Vince had systematically turned Dylan against her through manipulation and psychological abuse. Your Honor, Rebecca's lawyer argued, my client's son has been systematically programmed to reject his mother by a father who cannot forgive his wife's human failings. This is a classic case of parental alienation syndrome. Dylan, now 17 and built like a linebacker, sat in the witness chair with the same cold composure his father had taught him. He answered every question with measured precision, never raising his voice, never showing emotion. Mr. Crawford, the judge asked, how would you describe your relationship with your mother over the past year? Non-existent, Your Honor. She sends cards and tries to call, but I have no interest in maintaining contact with someone who abandoned our family for her own selfish desires. Don't you think you're being a bit harsh? Rebecca's lawyer pressed. People make mistakes. Shouldn't there be room for forgiveness? Dylan's response was swift and cutting. Forgiveness is for accidents and momentary lapses in judgment. My mother conducted a months-long affair, lied to my face daily, and was prepared to dismantle our family for a man who saw me as an inconvenience. That's not a mistake. That's a character defect. Vince felt a surge of pride. His son had learned the lesson perfectly. But Rebecca's lawyer wasn't finished. Mr. Crawford, isn't it true that your father has influenced your opinion through constant negative commentary about your mother? No, Dylan replied. My father has never said anything about my mother that wasn't factually accurate. She had an affair. She lied. She chose her lover over her family. These aren't opinions, they're facts. The lawyer turned to the judge. Your Honor, this child has clearly been poisoned against his mother by. He's been unhinged, violent, Rebecca suddenly interrupted, her voice cracking as she pointed at Dylan. I'm afraid of him. Afraid of what he's become under his father's influence. The courtroom fell silent. Dylan's face remained impassive, but Vince could see the hurt flash in his son's eyes before being quickly suppressed. The judge turned to Vince. Any questions? Vince stood slowly, holding Dylan's phone. The device contained 6 months of Rebecca's increasingly desperate voicemails and text messages, including several where she'd called Dylan just like his father and threatened to make him pay for choosing Vince over her. But the recording Vince planned to play was far more damaging. Rebecca, in her desperation to maintain contact with Dylan, had left a 20-minute voicemail the previous week after Dylan refused to meet her for coffee. In it, she'd revealed her true feelings about the situation, about Dylan, and about the kind of mother she'd really been. Just one, Vince replied, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. Shall I play the recording you secretly made of your mother? Dylan burst into tears, the first emotion he'd shown all day. The court reporter's pen froze as Rebecca's voice began to play from the phone speaker. Dylan, I know you think you hate me, but you need to understand something. I never wanted to be a mother. I was 22 when you were born, and I gave up everything for you and your father. Do you know what that's like? To watch your dreams disappear because you're trapped by responsibilities you never asked for. The voice continued, slurred slightly by wine, becoming more bitter with each sentence. Your father thinks he's so perfect, but he's cold, Dylan. He's turned you into the same kind of emotionless robot he is. At least Tyler made me feel alive, made me feel like a woman instead of just a wife and mother. Rebecca stood up abruptly. Stop it. Please stop. But the recording continued. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe you're better off with just your father. At least then I can finally live my own life without pretending to be someone I'm not. The silence in the courtroom was deafening when the recording ended. Dylan wiped his eyes and looked directly at his mother. That's who you really are, he said quietly. And that's why I choose my father. Chapter 8. Final Judgments. The judge's ruling was swift and merciless. Rebecca Crawford lost all custody rights to her son, was ordered to pay child support despite her limited income, and was granted supervised visitation only if Dylan requested it, which everyone in the courtroom knew would never happen. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca approached Vince and Dylan one last time. Tyler waited by a dented Honda Civic, looking as defeated as a man could while still breathing. Vince, please, Rebecca begged. He's still my son. No, Vince replied without emotion. He's my son. You gave up that right when you chose Tyler over your family. Rebecca turned to Dylan, tears streaming down her face. Dylan, I know I said terrible things, but I was drunk and angry. You have to believe that I love you. Dylan looked at the woman who'd given birth to him, and Vince saw the exact moment when the last thread of connection severed forever. I believe you love the idea of me, Dylan said, but you don't love me enough to put me first. You never did. That's not true. It is true, and it's okay, Mom, because I learned something important from watching you destroy our family. What? I learned what kind of person I never want to become. Dylan walked away, leaving Rebecca standing alone on the courthouse steps. Vince lingered for a moment, studying his ex-wife's tear-streaked face. This isn't over, she whispered. Someday Dylan will see what you really are. What am I, Rebecca? A monster who destroyed his own family out of pride. Vince smiled the same cold smile that had terrified her that night in their living room. No, Rebecca. I'm a man who protected his son from a mother who saw him as an obligation and a father figure who saw him as an inconvenience. I'm a man who refused to let my family be collateral damage in your selfish fantasy. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. And I'm a man who always collects what he's owed. This was just the interest payment. Vince walked away, leaving Rebecca to contemplate the wreckage of her choices. Tyler approached hesitantly, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. Don't touch me, she snapped. This is all your fault. My fault? You're the one who. Who what? Who believed your lies about loving me? Who thought you actually wanted a life with me and my son? Tyler's face hardened. I never promised you anything. You assumed. I assumed you were a man instead of a coward who runs when things get difficult. Their argument escalated quickly, drawn-out frustrations and mutual blame poisoning whatever remained of their relationship. Other people exiting the courthouse stopped to stare as Rebecca and Tyler aired their grievances publicly, their great love affair ending not with passion, but with recriminations and accusations. Vince and Dylan drove home in comfortable silence. The house felt different now, cleaner, somehow, with Rebecca's presence finally erased completely. Dylan had claimed his parents' master bedroom, saying it felt weird to have it sitting empty, and Vince had converted Rebecca's former office into a workshop for his architectural plans. Dad, Dylan said as they pulled into their driveway, do you think I'm too hard on people? Vince considered the question seriously. Do you think you are? Sometimes. Like maybe normal people would have forgiven Mom by now. Forgiveness is a luxury for people who don't understand consequences, Vince replied. Your mother made her choice, and she has to live with the results. That's not cruelty, that's justice. And if I'm wrong, if someday I regret cutting her out completely, Vince turned off the engine and looked at his son. Then you'll live with that choice too. But Dylan, understand this. The moment you start making exceptions for people who betray you, you signal to the world that your boundaries mean nothing. People will take everything you allow them to take. Dylan nodded slowly. Is that why you never try to work things out with her? Because it would have made you look weak? I never try to work things out with her because she chose another man over her family. There's no coming back from that. Ever. Chapter 9. New Foundations. 2 years later, Vincent Crawford stood in the kitchen of his home, preparing breakfast for Dylan before his son left for his freshman year at the state university. At 19, Dylan had inherited his father's height and his mother's eyes, but his character was purely his own, forged in the crucible of betrayal and hardened by the lessons of justice. The house was quiet except for the sizzle of bacon in the pan. Vince had never remarried, had barely dated. Some of his friends worried he was becoming a hermit, but Vince felt no loneliness. He had his work, his son, and the satisfaction of a life rebuilt on his own terms. Dad, there's an article about Mom in the Cleveland paper. Dylan called from the dining room, where he was reading on his laptop. What kind of article? She's getting married. To some accountant named Gary. Vince felt nothing at the news. Good for her. Dylan appeared in the kitchen doorway. The article mentions that she's a devoted stepmother to Gary's 2 kids. Weird, right? Since she was such a terrible mother to me. People reinvent themselves when they need to, Vince replied, plating the bacon. Maybe she'll be better at being a stepmother than she was at being your mother. Do you believe that? Vince handed Dylan his plate. I don't care enough to have an opinion about it. They ate breakfast in companionable silence. Two men who'd learned to find peace in each other's company. Dylan would leave for college in 3 hours, and the house would be empty for the first time in Vince's adult life. You gonna be okay here by yourself? Dylan asked. I raised you to be independent, Vince replied. Time I practiced what I preached. And if mom tries to contact me at school, that's your decision to make. You're an adult now. Dylan nodded, understanding the weight of that responsibility. What about Tyler? Ever wonder what happened to him? Vince had known, of course. His network of contacts in the construction industry extended throughout the region, and information flowed naturally to him. Tyler had drifted from town to town, unable to hold steady employment, his reputation preceding him thanks to carefully placed words in the right ears. He was currently living in a studio apartment in Akron, delivering groceries for minimum wage and struggling with alcohol dependency. I assume he's living with the consequences of his choices, Vince said simply. After Dylan left for college, Vince walked through the empty house, noting what needed to be updated or repaired. The silence was profound but not oppressive. He'd built this life deliberately, removing every element that didn't serve his purposes, and what remained was solid, reliable, and completely under his control. His phone rang around noon. The caller ID showed Rebecca's new number. She tried calling several times over the past 2 years, always blocked by Vince and ignored by Dylan. For the first time in 24 months, Vince answered. Hello, Rebecca. Vince. Her voice was older, wearier. I heard Dylan started college. He did. I wanted to. I was hoping to maybe send him a card or... Don't. Vince, please. He's my son, too. He was your son. You gave up that relationship when you chose Tyler over your family. Nothing has changed. Everything's changed. I'm married now. I have a new family. I've learned. You've learned nothing, Vince interrupted. You've simply found new people to disappoint. That's not fair. Fair. Vince's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. You abandoned your son for a convicted felon with a history of violence. You called Dylan violent and unstable in open court. You left him a voicemail saying you never wanted to be a mother. And now you want me to believe you've changed. People can change, Vince. People can grow. Some people can. You're not one of them. You're a selfish woman who makes selfish choices and then expects the world to forgive you when those choices have consequences. The line was quiet for a long moment. When Rebecca spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. What do I have to do to earn forgiveness? What would it take? Vince looked out the window at his front yard, where he'd taught Dylan to throw a football, where they'd built snowmen and raked leaves and lived their lives without her. Nothing you could ever do would be enough, he said finally. Because forgiveness requires remorse, and remorse requires accepting responsibility for the harm you caused. You're calling me because you feel guilty, not because you understand what you destroyed. Understand? You understand nothing. You destroyed a 16-year-old boy's faith in unconditional love. You taught him that the person who was supposed to protect him would abandon him for her own gratification. You turned his mother into a stranger who saw him as an obstacle to her happiness. Rebecca was crying now. I know I made mistakes. Mistakes. Vince's voice turned deadly quiet. A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk at the store. What you did was a calculated betrayal of everyone who trusted you. And the fact that you still can't see the difference is exactly why you'll never be part of his life again. Vince, please. Goodbye, Rebecca. Don't call again. Vince hung up and blocked her number permanently. He stood in his empty kitchen, surrounded by the life he'd built from the ashes of her betrayal, and felt nothing but satisfaction. Outside, construction crews were working on a new subdivision he was developing. His business had thrived in the years since the divorce, perhaps because he'd learned to value loyalty and competence above all other virtues. His employees knew that Vincent Crawford rewarded excellence and destroyed those who betrayed his trust. Dylan called that evening from his dorm room, excited about his classes and new friends. He mentioned meeting a girl named Ashley who was studying to be a teacher, and Vince smiled at the irony. Just remember what I taught you about trust, Vince said. I remember everything you taught me, Dad, including the most important lesson, which is that people show you who they really are through their actions, not their words. And once they show you, believe them. After they hung up, Vince poured himself a glass of wine and sat on his back deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. He thought about Rebecca, probably crying to her new